Great pleasure to welcome Professor Mark Hallett from the Quadram Institute, who's going to tell us about waking the dead.
Hi, sorry for the delays there, technical problems. What I'm trying to do is do a recording of the talk onto the Mac so it can then be shoved up on YouTube, so then you can listen to it in the bath or over Christmas dinner or whatever you want, and recap. What we've managed to do is get it in presenter view, so it'll look a bit funny as a video, but it won't be too bad. It'll still be good enough to be worth watching. So, as I say, as you heard, my name's Mark Hallett. I work over at the Quadram. I'm a bacteriologist by trade and by training, but I have an interest in evolution, a general interest in evolution. I've written a book called The Rough Guide to Evolution, and I've always been fascinated by human evolution. And about 10 years ago when I was in Birmingham, someone was teaching about human evolution, genome evolution and genetics, left in a hurry, and they said, oh, could you do it? And I said, well, I work on bacteria, but I suppose so. And in fact, it turned out to be one of the most exciting things I've done, actually. Giving lectures every year on this subject, it's so fast moving and so fascinating and so surprising as to what turns up in this field. What I'm going to do also is I'm going to present you with quite a few papers. I'm taking the view that as third years that you perhaps start to realise that information doesn't come out of textbooks in this very clear-cut way, that actually some of the information out there is disputed, some of it's very new, some of it hasn't quite bedded down, there's no consensus. And so I'm going to be presenting you findings from the papers that have come out recently, rather than try and make this a rigidly, clear set of bullet points that you would find in a first-year PowerPoint presentation. Right, so we start our journey, start our day in a place called Neanderthal. So Neanderthal is actually it just means Neander Valley in German. It's a valley near Düsseldorf, and it's named after a local pastor whose name was Joachim Neumann, which means Newman. And I don't know why, perhaps it was some romantic idea, but they decided to turn that into Greek when they named the local valley after him. So Neander is just a Greek form of Newman. And so it was called Neanderthal, Neander Valley, and it was spelt in the old days with a TH at the beginning, but they had a spelling reform at the beginning of the 20th century, and the Tal with an H became Tal without an H. It's cognate with the English word dale, is another word, so it's Neanderdale, if you like. But this is annoying because the old form was ossified in taxonomic use, and both forms are now used. In the UK, we use the old form with the TH. In America, they use without the TH. And you'll find nature uses TH, science doesn't have the TH, has a T. It's a frustrating thing. Anyway, let's get on. So what actually happened in Neanderthal? Well, Neanderthal, this valley was a limestone valley, and there were lots of caves and rock shelters along the valley, including one that was known as the Kleine Feldhofquarter. And in the 1850s, they began quarrying limestone as part of the Industrial Revolution was kicking in, and they needed all this limestone to make coke and so forth. And they started removing the caves and the valley walls. And in this little grotto, the Kleine Feldhofquarter, there was discovered a skull cap and 15 postcranial bones. Here's the skull cap here. Initially, people thought, oh, this is a cave bear that had just been living in that cave. But it was shown to a local teacher who said, no, this looks kind of human, but not human as we know it. And this was the first time that anyone had actually described a convincing, not quite human kind of fossil in this way. Now, one of the things, as I say, this field is just amazing in the things that turn up. About 150 years later, some people went back to Neanderthal, to that site, and they thought, I wonder if we can find any more Neanderthal samples. So it was called Neanderthal man. And so I wonder if we can find any more Neanderthal man samples. And because there had been extensive reworking of the valley walls, you couldn't just straightforwardly go to the place. But what they did was they looked at all the local landmarks, and they used kind of like trigonometry to work out where they thought the original Neanderthal site was. And they started digging there, and they turned up a load of more Neanderthal bones. Absolutely amazing. They could go back nearly 150 years later. But even more amazing was that one of the bones they discovered fitted with one of the bones that had been discovered 150 years earlier, like pieces of jigsaw. They came from the same bone in the same individual. So it's absolutely amazing example of kind of archaeological detective work in actually turning that up. Now, a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to go to Neanderthal, and here's a picture that was in the museum there showing what it used to look like, kind of like Cheddar Gorge or somewhere like that. This is what the site looks like now. So these here mark where the second excavation took place, the more recent one, and it's thought that the actual cave itself was up here on this escarpment. This now just looks like an escarpment. Since the initial discovery, there's over 400 specimens have been found over a wide range within Europe, and now more recently we discovered even extending into Asia, into Siberia, in particular at the furthest extent of this. But you can see there in Europe, all around the places that were not covered by the ice sheets back during the ice ages. And you know, lots of skulls, lots of complete skeletons as well, lots of material. Now the first reconstructions, here's one outside the Neanderthal Museum at Neanderthal. You know, they make these individuals look nasty, kind of brutish cavemen, you know, your archetypal cavemen. More recently though, people have been a lot more sympathetic in their reconstructions. There's this old guy here, and this young Neanderthal child, young girl here, I think very sympathetic reconstruction there. Now, I think it was early in the 20th century, one paleoanthropologist pointed out that, well, actually Neanderthals weren't that different from us. If you put them in a suit and tie and you saw them walking down the street, you wouldn't notice. And so at the Neanderthal Museum, that's what they did. They made a Neanderthal and they put him in a he hasn't got a tie on, he's got a suit on. And, you know, if you saw that guy walking down the street, I mean, if I supply you with an age-matched, anatomically modern human control alongside the guy, you can see that doesn't look that different, really. And so we've certainly come to a view now that the Neanderthals are much more sophisticated. They were our close cousins rather than some kind of brutish ancestor. In terms of the timeline, we first see Neanderthal features about 350,000 years ago, and then the full-blown Neanderthals over this time period here. And then they survived. People used to, there was talk they might have survived to 25,000 years ago. I think that's now no longer believed. About 40,000 years ago in Europe, or maybe just slightly less than 40,000 years ago. And what that means is that they did overlap, probably in time and range, with anatomically modern humans. But nobody's ever found a site where you can find Neanderthals and modern humans mixed together. But they were certainly in Europe and probably in parts of West Asia at the same time. Now, they clearly are very distinct from us in terms of their anatomical features. Bigger than, say, the difference between a bonobo and a common chimp. They're much more robust than we are, pronounced brow ridge, projected midface, this low, flat, elongated skull with what they call an occipital bun at the back here, and they're kind of chinless. But their average brain size is just slightly larger than that of anatomically modern humans. So this idea that they're sort of primitive is somewhat on weak ground there. Now, of course, the big question, though, they overlapped in time and space with anatomically modern humans, but then they're not here now. So did they die out? Were they a branch that came off and then just petered out and died out? Or did they feed in to modern humans? Was there admixture? Did they make any contribution to our ancestry? Now, this particular slide here illustrates a point which I make in lectures when I give this at other places, which I won't have time to talk about today, but that's the so-called out of Africa hypothesis, which is that all of us anatomically modern humans, have a recent common origin in Africa. And all of the people who live outside of Africa are descended, primarily at least, from one exodus out of Africa. And so this was an interesting question as to when anatomically modern humans left Africa, came into contact with Neanderthals, did anything happen there? That's talking about things in rather dry scholarly language. What you really want to know is this. Did Neanderthals and humans actually have sex? So the answer to that question, the only way we're really going to get to that is to look at ancient DNA. Can we get any ancient DNA sequences from Neanderthals? Now you might say this was just, wow, this is not going to be possible, surely. And I think, in the early days when people were doing DNA sequencing, it was something just completely off the radar. But there's a guy called Svante Pääbo, who I would consider to be one of the superheroes of science, who actually transformed our understanding of human evolution and human life by getting ancient DNA sequences out of archaic material like these Neanderthals. So they actually, back in 1997, 20 years ago now, they extracted some DNA. They used to do it by PCR in those days. They did little short overlapping PCR products. And they extracted mitochondrial DNA. So I'm assuming you know enough about genetics to know that the mitochondrion has its own genome. It's a very small genome. It's only transmitted on the maternal line. But because it's a much higher copy number than the autosomes, it's also very useful and it varies between individuals in a way that you can analyse quite easily. They chose to look for mitochondrial DNA. They got mitochondrial DNA sequences out of Neanderthals, and they drew a tree of modern humans and Neanderthals. And so you've got the point I made a minute ago, which is a whole lecture if you want to look at it on YouTube. Most of the diversity in humans is in Africa. There's a little branch here with non-Africans in it and a few Africans as well. But the Neanderthals were clearly an outgroup, separated from all the diversity that's within anatomically modern humans in today's world. So that, basically, people say, yeah, they are a different species. In evolutionary terms, they wandered off in a certain direction hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we wandered off in another direction, and never the twain shall meet. And that was the conclusion that came from that. But having established that you could get ancient DNA sequences, there were some follow-up studies where people did use PCR to amplify up various gene fragments from these Neanderthal samples. And they were able to start piecing together some of the biology of Neanderthals using ancient DNA sequences. So there's one here looking at a melanocortin 1 receptor allele, suggesting that there was varying pigmentation among Neanderthals. So they probably had pale skin colour, like modern Europeans. But in fact, this allele that they amplified isn't found in modern Europeans, so they may have had a different way of becoming lighter skinned. People were able to look at the ABO blood group and show that yes, you could blood type them. Bit of taste perception. I mean, if anyone's done 23andMe, this is the kind of nonsense that you get told from your genome. They can reliably tell you whether you can taste bitter taste or not, and whether you've got hard wax or soft wax. So this was one of those examples where they were able to do this bitter taste perception analysis. And another thing that was looked at is a gene called FOXP2, which I'm not sure if you've heard about, is a gene that appears to have undergone rapid evolution on the hominin line since we diverged from chimpanzees, and is thought to be perhaps associated with our capacity for speech, although that is a gross simplification of what it might actually be doing. But interestingly, the variant that we have is shared by the Neanderthals. That's all well and good, picking up bits and pieces here and there, but effectively the ground shook and one was knocked off your chair in 2010 when Svante Pääbo and his team, a very big team as you can see now, managed to get a draft genome sequence, 4 billion nucleotides worth of Neanderthal sequence. And they were able to show that if you looked at the divergences from the reference genomes of different ethnic groups, they roughly sat here about 10%, but Neanderthals were just slightly further over these three sequences that they looked at. But of course the first question is, are Neanderthals more closely related to some anatomically modern humans than others? So if there had been any kind of interbreeding, we might expect to see, and what everyone expected to see was that Europeans might have had a bit of Neanderthal in them. So if we look at those derived SNPs, the things that are seen in the Neanderthal lineage and modern humans that are separate from what we see in the ancestry with chimps, you can look at this and then you can compare it with contemporary human genomes. And what it showed, and this was the thing that was really quite surprising, it was that when you look at Europeans, East Asians and West Africans, you can clearly see that Neanderthals are closer to the Europeans and the East Asians. So the similarity was with all non-Africans. And that was surprising. People didn't quite expect that. But this was confirmed when they did more sophisticated comparisons. So they looked at the San, which are Bushmen that live in southern Africa, and they are considered to be the earliest branch of anatomically modern humans, probably branched off from the rest of us about 100,000 years ago or more. And Yoruba, West Africans, Han Chinese, French, and Papua New Guinean Papuans. And this confirmed that the direction of flow was actually from Neanderthals to non-African humans, because there was, when you actually look at the relationship between San, Yoruba, and non-Africans, the Yoruba are slightly closer to non-Africans than the San, whereas the Neanderthals were equidistant from both. So that suggested that they were able to assume, therefore, that Neanderthal DNA had come into the non-African humans rather than non-African humans giving DNA to Neanderthals. Now, back then, the reference genome, the main, was Craig Venter, this kind of maverick American guy who stirred things up by commercialising the human genome sequence, and it turned out it was his own genome sequence that was being sequenced in his venture. Parts of him were more Neanderthal than they were African, which is quite shocking. And the conclusion was that somewhere between 1% and 4% of non-African genome is Neanderthal. So we can basically say, yes, there was some kind of love pact going on here, between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals. Somewhere at this point here, after we branch off from the non-Europeans branch off from the Africans. Now, in these politically correct days, the things I show you, I have to be very careful about. There was actually a track, a song called Neanderthal Man, all about this whole business of Neanderthal love back in the 1970s. It was number 2 in the charts here. And I did think of showing you the video, but it is rather dated. But if you like cheesy music from the 1970s and you don't mind watching people scantily dressed dancers dance in cavemen clothes, then maybe you want to look that up on YouTube sometime. So let's have a look around the room. Yeah, almost everyone in this room has Neanderthal ancestry. We can be quite confident of that. And I know that I have Neanderthal ancestry because I went to 23andMe, and this is what they told me. 2.8% of my DNA is from Neanderthals. And I'm ranked first among my friends. I've only got one friend here, sorry.
I'm 25, you're higher than me.
Oh, right, okay. 2.5, you mean? If you were 25, I think we'd be putting you in a little lab where we could study you for the rest of the time. Yeah, and you can see that my daughter is actually, she's 2.7%, so I'm a little bit more Neanderthal. What that possibly is, that if you believe, 23andMe is like genomic astrology, you shouldn't read too much in, but she was told that she's a 1,000th African ancestry, so maybe that accounts for the slight difference in our Neanderthalness. But there we go, so I am in part Neanderthal. Now, I think that's all pretty cool. I think, if Svante Pääbo had just given us Neanderthal genomes, he would be a superhero and remembered for the rest of the time. But, it's a bit of Hamlet, really, to capture this. I mean, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than I've dreamt of in your philosophy. What we found was there was a finger bone found in a cave in Siberia, and people didn't know what it was. They thought it might be Neanderthal. There were some Neanderthal remains found in that cave. They extracted DNA and sequenced it. And what they found was actually it was a completely different kind of human again. And it was as different, more or less as different from us as Neanderthals are. Sits outside of the variation within modern humans, sits outside the variation within Neanderthals. At this time they claimed shared common ancestors about a million years ago. I think that's probably a bit further back than we're thinking now. But wow, okay, so this mitochondrial genome they got out of this cave, out of this little finger, suggests that there was a wholly other lineage, apart from modern humans and Neanderthals, out there. And this just shows you, this is where the cave was, in the Altai Mountains here, where I think Kazakhstan and Mongolia and Siberia kind of meet. And here you can see there's all our anatomically modern humans, and that's actually a very misleading thing because you've got lots of non-Africans there. But you can see that most of the diversity is actually within Africa. Then you've got the Neanderthals here, and by then they had several mitochondrial genomes of Neanderthals, and then this individual out here. Now, what they decided to do, they thought, we're not going to get bogged down as to whether this is another species of human and give it a Latin name, a binomial, and all that sort of stuff. We're just going to call them the Denisovans, after the Denisova cave where it was found. And yeah, you can argue with Neanderthal man is actually called Homo neanderthalensis in the actual official nomenclature. But they decided to say, well, we're not going to argue about whether it's a species or not. We're just going to say that it exists and that's its name. And, as I say, just fast forward a few more years, and now we have, first of all, we had a draft genome from Denisovans, and now we have a very high coverage genome sequence, I think 30-fold coverage, which is not bad for a modern human sequence. And so that allowed us to understand the genetic history of these individuals a lot better. And again, the same questions. Did they interbreed with modern humans? What's going on? And it turns out when you look at modern human genomes, and as we get more and more from around the world, these things become clearer, that actually the Denisovans did actually interbreed, but the main signal was found among Melanesians. So people from Papua New Guinea, Australian Aborigines, and so forth. Which is a bit weird because this cave was a long way from Melanesia and Australasia, but that does appear to be the way things have worked out when we look at this. So all of us non-Africans have up 2% plus of your genome from Neanderthals, and people who are from Melanesia or from Australasia have some Denisovan DNA. And so, this is the schema that we kind of now buy into, that modern humans swept out of Africa 70,000 years ago. The dates seem to change. I think the most recent is 50. The oldest might be 100,000 years. People debate whether there were, probably looks like there were more than one exodus from Africa of modern humans as well. But this is a simple view. We came out of Africa, we went into Europe, and we went into Asia. And when we were in Europe, we met the Neanderthals, and when we were in Asia, we met the Denisovans. Okay, so some of you are saying, well, you're telling us a nice story here, but what's this got to do with medicine? What's this got to do with anything of today? And you're talking about the past, so what? Well, one of the interesting things that people have now been able to do, now we recognise that this ancestry is there, you can go looking for it in modern humans. And people have actually been going through all the human gene, anatomically modern human genomes, and trying to actually pull out the Neanderthal ancestry. And it's estimated that probably figures between 20 and 50% of the Neanderthal genome is out here wandering around in our modern world in us. And if you go, so there wasn't just one mating between one Neanderthal and one anatomically modern human. There are obviously multiple matings, and that has allowed us to recapture multiple Neanderthal-derived alleles that we can then drill back and start to say, well, what does this mean in terms of biology? So in fact, here one of these figures, average length of introgress haplotype about 57 kilobases. And about, just over a quarter of all protein-coding genes have one or more exons that overlap to Neanderthal sequence in anatomically modern human, in non-African modern humans. Look at that in more detail. Each of us is only carrying a small amount. I'm 2.7, you're 2.5. But if you go across thousands of genomes, you can then start to ramp up the amount of a Neanderthal genome you're recovering. It varies, though, across the genome. So if you go down through your genome, it's not that every 2.7% of every gene is Neanderthal, 2.7% of every stretch of base pairs is that. It varies quite considerably. And it appears that, therefore, that some of these Neanderthal sequences are deleterious when they're in an anatomically modern human background, and it seems that some of them are just lost. There are fitness consequences to hybridization. And one of the key points there is that there's 5-fold less Neanderthal ancestry on the X chromosome than on the autosomes. And that suggests that when you have a male hybrid offspring that's only got one X chromosome, so it's got anatomically modern, half of its nuclear genome is anatomically modern human, but it's just got one X chromosome, and that's Neanderthal. There's some kind of fitness cost, crosstalk between the genes on the X chromosome and those on the modern human autosome. Something's not quite as good as it could be, and there's an evolutionary cost of some sort to that. So another way, more perhaps figuratively, of talking about this, if you go through the genome and look through the genome, you can see what you might call Neanderthal deserts. So there are parts of modern European and Asian genomes that do not have any Neanderthal stuff in them at all. The largest one is this 15 megabase region on chromosome 7 that actually contains this gene FOXP2, and if you do GWAS studies, there are some associations with that region with autism. Whether that means anything or not about what it means to be specifically modern human rather than Neanderthal is difficult to say. But it does appear that there, if you look at the regions that are depleted, there are regions that actually have a lot of genes that are expressed in specific brain regions. So here's if you actually look at the percentage of Neanderthal as you go across the genome, it's around 2%. So then suddenly there are parts where it just drops down to nothing. That's interesting. But more interesting is what's the Neanderthal DNA that survived doing? So what's the legacy of us having that Neanderthal DNA in our genomes? And when people write papers, they always like to make a nice narrative and tell you a story, simple takeaway message. And this paper here, made it quite straightforward. Archaic hominin admixture facilitated adaptation to out-of-Africa environments. So this is a guy called Josh Akey, who's one of the pioneers in looking at what there is Neanderthal genes there are in modern humans. And what he said was that you can see that there are some immune-related genes that are clearly Neanderthal and very common in modern populations, and there are some skin pigmentation genes. And if you go along the chromosome, you can see a part of the genome where there's not much, and then suddenly, whoosh, 60% of individuals are carrying Neanderthal at that locus in a European or an Asian population. So one of the ones he looked at is this OCA2. It's a transmembrane protein involved in pigmentation. It's come from Neanderthals. But when you drill down to the detail, it doesn't overlap with known targets of positive selection in humans or known pigmentation traits in modern humans. But it does contain a variant associated with blue versus brown eyes in Europeans. And in fact, the haplotype that comes from Neanderthals doesn't contain any coding variants, but there are variants in the regulatory regions. So, it looks as if there has been positive selection here on variants that have come from Neanderthals and that they have made a contribution to the modern human biology among non-African individuals. Another set of genes encode antiviral proteins, and it may be that these are providing some additional protection against infection, and we'll say more about that in a moment. And there's also a TLR1 haplotype that's come across, which has been associated with various immune traits, including whether you're carrying this organism H. pylori in your stomach, what kind of allergy burden, cellular responses, and so forth. And so this Neanderthal haplotype does appear to influence the expression of this TLR in a context-dependent manner, particularly in stimulated immune cells. So again, there's a very strong hint here that Neanderthal ancestry is actually contributing to modern human variation and modern human biology. There's a couple more before we move on to even more provocative statements on this. So it appears that it's not just Neanderthals, that Denisovans have actually donated genes that have survived and have interesting effects in modern humans. And this paper here, they show that the adaptation to altitude in Tibetans living high up on the Tibetan plateau appears to be caused by introgression of DNA sequences that have come from Denisovans, which are not found in other ethnic groups and so not found in very, very rare. They are found occasionally, but not very rare in Han Chinese, but very, very prevalent, highly prevalent among Tibetans. And here's another example, HLA. There's a particular HLA allele, HLA-B73 allele, which appears to have been acquired from Denisovans. And other HLA alleles also appear to have come from Neanderthals. So this, Josh Akey and various others put out this very provocative paper a couple of years ago, where they showed that basically they analysed the variants, the Neanderthal variants, and they looked at 1,000 electronic health record-derived phenotypes in 28,000 adults of European ancestry. And what they found was repeated associations of Neanderthal alleles with a whole range of medically relevant phenotypes, if you like, so neurological, psychiatric, immunological, dermatological phenotypes. And so what they're claiming is that these Neanderthal alleles together explain a significant fraction of variation in risk for depression, for skin lesions that arise from sun exposure, so-called actinic keratitis, and also hypercoagulation, tobacco use. These things also seem to be influenced by our Neanderthal ancestry. Now, obviously, in the press, they just, okay, so you can blame the Neanderthals for the fact you smoked too much, is a very simple takeaway message that was taken there. And it's clear that the devil's in the detail here, that actually drilling down and working out exactly what this all means is going to take a lot more effort. But here were 4 SNPs that they had significant replicating phenotype associations that they said were particularly significant here. This hypercoagulable state, responses in protein, calorie, nutrition, urinary symptoms, and tobacco use disorder. It's a very judgmental way of talking about tobacco use, I suppose, but there we are. And those are all down to Neanderthals. And just to pull out a few more points from that paper, functional associations between skin, immune system, depression, addiction, metabolism. Now you can argue, well, hang on, what's going on here? You're saying that Neanderthal DNA Some of it was lost because it was selected against. But there was some of it left, but some of it left is making us sick. So isn't that a bit odd? Why isn't that being selected against? And they do make that point at the end of the paper that, well, yeah, maybe this can be explained by some of these alleles. You know, there are many conditions where there's a trade-off. So something that appears to be deleterious in a certain set of circumstances actually does provide a benefit somewhere else, you know, like sickle cell with malaria. So what they're saying here is, you know, did some of these alleles actually provide a benefit in those early anatomically modern human populations as they moved out of Africa, but now they're detrimental? You've probably been told already about, you know, the just so stories in evolution and how you have to be careful about not too heavily overlaying narratives over the data in front of you and being quite careful and cautious. I think it's a reasonable ways to interpret the data. I think at the moment we're still at the stage where this is not a mature field. It's exciting, absolutely amazing and exciting, but probably have to come back in 5 or 10 years and things will settle down, and then we'll have a much more mature idea of what's going on here. Here's a paper from Janet Kelso and Michael Danneman, where they tried to do the same kind of thing using phenotypes from the UK Biobank. And here they said there were 4 phenotypes, all behavioural, to which Neanderthal ancients contribute more phenotype than non-archaic animals. Chronotype, so that means whether you like getting out of bed early in the morning or whether you like staying up late. I'm one of those people who like to get up early in the morning. Loneliness or isolation, that's a bit of a visual thing. Frequency of unenthusiasm or disinterest in the last 2 weeks. And smoking status. Now, of course, you know, they've all got genetic components, but as us old people will know, when we look at you young students, they also have an environmental and an age-related thing. So, you know, probably some of these things happen at the extremes of age rather than in the middle of life, and so on. But anyway, they found this these correlations, and so this field, as I say, is maturing. We're not quite there. We don't quite yet have a fixed view on everything and what it all means. Here's another provocative paper which has appeared, I think it came out as a preprint on bioRxiv, where what they looked at was they said, well, let's look at all the proteins that we know that are encoded by the human genome that interact with viruses. And let's go and look at those genes and then look and see whether there's any Neanderthal influence on those genes, introgression on those genes. And what they concluded was that, yes, there was. It does appear as if there were these adaptive introgressions of genes encoding proteins that interact with viruses. And they even went so far, and I've quickly read this paper, I need to read it more carefully. They've even tried to predict which kinds of viruses were driving this introgression or selecting for the introgressed Neanderthal sequences. And so one theory that is floating around, there's a guy called Simon Under down in Oxford. Brooks also been putting this with Charlotte Holtzbreck. This idea that when anatomically modern humans came out of Africa and met Neanderthals, they exchanged pathogens. This could work in both ways. And it's often described as trading of poisons and antidotes. So that maybe we gave the Neanderthals a load of nasty things that had evolved in Africa over hundreds of thousands of years since our divergence from Neanderthals. Neanderthals had also come across a whole load of things that had not been seen by these people coming out of Africa, and they exchanged pathogens. And it's certainly a very plausible set of hypotheses that, to look at. We know that similar things happen when Europeans colonised the New World, and so it's certainly a very plausible hypothesis, but actually nailing it down and putting flesh on the bones is going to be a difficult one. One idea that is floating around, well, one question which I haven't addressed that's floating around is, why did Neanderthals die out? And why is the world populated with us, anatomically modern humans, and not Neanderthals? And one idea is that we came and we were just that much fitter than they were in dealing with infection in particular. And in this study here, they went to look at the polymorphisms among genes involved in the immune system and the immune response. And what they showed was that actually, we know that if you look at how inbred Neanderthals were compared to modern humans, they were more inbred than us. They had less genetic diversity. And that appears to be the case in most of these immune genes as well. So that is compatible with the idea that their population wasn't as robust against infection as anatomically modern humans, and maybe that's the thing we gave them a load of nasty diseases that wiped them out. But they did point out that actually, when it comes to MHC genes, the Neanderthals had comparable levels of diversity to modern humans. So it's not a straightforward black and white thing that they're just simply inbred and that's it. And maybe there was some, they're pointing out there may be some balancing evolution going on here to, you know. Again, it's all very provocative, and it'll be interesting to see where we end up in a few years' time when this has all become a lot more mature. Now, as it happens, I've got through things fairly quickly. I wasn't sure how long and how well to pace this. But one other interesting report that just came out recently, well, last year, looking at selective sweeps since we diverged from the Neanderthals. So this is another way we can look at evolution. It's like, well, what actually made us anatomically modern humans, not Neanderthal? What evolution has happened in our lineage that isn't there in the Neanderthals? And one clear signal is with the gene amylase. Modern humans have many more copies of the amylase gene than, say, chimpanzees or the common ancestor. This is thought to be an adaptation to eating starchy foods, and maybe, again, it's one of these things, it's an interesting idea that maybe cooking tubers and then that allowed us to access this starchy food. And if you have lots of amylase that can break it down quickly, then that gives you a selective advantage in a marginal situation where perhaps you've also got diarrhea or you're starving or something. So this is an interesting finding that seems to have post-dated our split with them. And if we're going to talk about what does ancient DNA tell us about human evolution, there's a whole other lecture about what it tells us about the evolution of anatomically modern humans, because I've been very biased. I told you a simple story about Neanderthals. I've spoken about archaic human lineages, Neanderthals and Denisovans. But in fact, there's been, in recent years, there's just been an explosion in ancient genomes coming out of sites across the world. And the majority of them are anatomically modern human. And they're telling us about the evolution that has gone on over the last thousands, tens of thousands of years in anatomically modern human lineages, irrespective of anything to do with the archaic introgression. And just one simple takeaway example here is that among modern Europeans, most of us have persistence of lactase into adult life. So lactase is an enzyme that allows you to break down lactose. Lactose is a sugar found in milk, and in most mammals, it's only produced during the time when the infant is actually suckling milk, and then it has no use. You don't get exposed to lactose after that. But obviously with the introduction of agriculture, where humans started drinking the milk of other species, goats and sheep and cattle and so forth, we started being exposed to lactose in late childhood and adult life. And this provided us with an additional food source, an energy source, but it also has the presence of large amounts of lactose without being broken down can have effects on the gut microbiota, can lead to diarrhea. And so there was a selection for the persistence of the lactase gene being expressed all the way through life, not just in infancy. And you can actually look at the parts of the genome that are responsible for that in these ancient DNA data sets, and they've been able to show that that the annual frequency of lactose persistence basically started to take off about 5,000 years ago, and then just went up massively. So that by the time you're 1,000 years ago, you're getting over 50% of individuals are now actually lactose tolerant, lactose persisters. So, and there were many stories like this that are going to come out as we are getting this just saturation of so many human genomes. There's whole stories to tell about the movement of peoples in Europe over the last tens of thousands of years as well. But that's another story. I've now finished. So, in conclusion, anatomically modern humans shared the planet with archaic hominins, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. In fact, it's more complicated than that because we now know that there were at least two, maybe three other archaic lineages that we shared the planet with at various times. You may have come across these very diminutive hominins that were found on an island called Flores, Homo floresiensis, popularly known as the Hobbit. So far, nobody's been able to get any DNA sequences out of those, but they're clearly there as another lineage. It appears that there is some kind of hidden African lineage, archaic African lineage, and that some people in Africa have admixture from an unknown source, particularly in West Africa. And there are some odd-looking crania that have been found in West Africa as well, suggesting there might have been another lineage there. And I think, if I'm trying to remember now, there's another lineage that may have contributed also to the Denisovans that has been sort of picked out of their DNA. So it's clear, the way we live now, where just one kind of human across the whole planet, is not the way that we live for most of our ancestry. And this, some people call this the Planet of the Apes scenario. It applies not just to these archaic human lineages, but if you go back like millions of years, at each stage there were multiple groups of apes that were fairly closely related to our lineage. Anyway, that's me pretty much finished. I've put some stuff up on Blackboard. I've put a couple of reviews up there. When I've done this in the past, and I put up all the papers, I've had students then come to me sort of that afternoon saying, "Oh my goodness, you've given us 20 papers. Oh, I can't possibly do 20 papers for one lecture." Oh. So I just put two reviews that perhaps you might want to look at. But I would hope that some of you at least might want to look at the primary literature, so I have provided it all as well, and you can download it if you want to. If you're interested